When it comes to video games, I find myself more interested in companions and villains than any other kind of character. A while back, I even made a video where I explored what goes into creating a likable companion. And now I want to look at the other side of the coin and discuss what makes a likable villain. Before I go too deep into things, I want to make a distinction between a good villain and a likable one. A good villain creates external and internal conflict for the protagonist, heightening the stakes of the story. What makes a good villain is entirely dependent on how they push a narrative forward, and it has little to do with whether or not the player likes them. Characters like Andrew Ryan from BioShock, Rafe Adler from Uncharted 4, and even Battleline from Celeste all do an incredible job of motivating the protagonist and player by irritating them. They are so easy to dislike and be angry with, further magnifying the narrative's conflict. Likeable villains, however, are ones that players grow a strange attachment to, and in some cases are even rooting for despite them being generally pretty horrible. So when I say likable villains, this is what I'm referring to. Characters you should probably hate, but actually enjoy having around. This of course leads to the question, what goes into making a likable video game villain? And to answer that, it's important to look at how villains from games differ from ones from other kinds of media. Creating a likable villain in a video game is a difficult task because of how games typically approach point of view. Where games often just stick to the perspective of the protagonist, TV shows, films, and books are more likely to jump between characters. Shows like Daredevil, Justified, and Game of Thrones spend a lot of time developing their villains away from the heroes, allowing the audience to better understand and relate to them, while also raising the stakes for their inevitable confrontations with the good guys.
We're going to die tomorrow, Lord Bolt. Sleep well.
One of my favorite recent examples of this is from the BBC show Killing Eve. Each episode is split between the protagonist, Eve, an MI6 operative, and Villanelle, the serial murderer Eve is trying to track down. This setup of focusing on both Eve and Villanelle gives viewers the chance to see Villanelle through a lens not tinted by fear. In most media, scenes with serial killers in them are tense and terrifying, but the majority of scenes with Villanelle and her victims are surprisingly funny. Her sick sense of humor and various quirks are always on display, subverting the viewer's expectations of what a killer should be, and in a twisted way, it makes her fun to watch. While I rooted for Eve, I also wanted Villanelle to keep getting away with her crimes so that the fun of the show could continue. And I think that feeling is at the core of most likable villains. The knowledge that they need to be stopped, but also a nagging sense that them losing would almost be as sad as the protagonist losing. This is hard to develop in games because it is jarring to pull away from the point of view of the character one is playing as. So the majority of interactions a player ends up having with a villain are in situations where the two characters are in the same place and typically in direct opposition with each other. While there are obviously exceptions, it is difficult to connect with a villain when every interaction with them leads to conflict. Some titles try to solve this by showing cutscenes of what the villain is up to elsewhere, but even then, developers are limited on how much they can show because when most people decide to play a game, they want to play a game and not watch a movie's worth of cutscenes, usually. Final Fantasy VII had some success doing something similar by having playable flashbacks of a time when the protagonist was aligned with the villain, showing how things came to be. But this method can also grind the pace of the primary narrative to a halt. A different solution is letting the player play as both the protagonist and the villain, but that obviously creates a whole different set of things to balance, like how evil to make the villain, and how to still make it clear that they are actually the bad guy. The most common way games get around this is by having the villain in constant communication with the protagonist and player from afar. This idea was popularized with the radios in BioShock, and many big games have followed its example since. Handsome Jack from Borderlands 2 and Pagan Min from Far Cry 4 are both solid examples of characters who benefit from being able to communicate directly to the player, giving a chance to learn about them in a context devoid of conflict. It allows players to appreciate their eccentric personalities without having to worry about the tension of being murdered by them. Arguably the most popular example of this is GLaDOS from Portal. She is in control of Aperture Science's Enrichment Center, but this control only allows her to have limited interactions with the protagonist and player. GLaDOS also is not openly hostile to the main character at the start of the first game. She is introduced as the guide and proctor for the various tests, and it isn't until later that she unceremoniously tries to murder the protagonist. By portraying GLaDOS in this way, players get to appreciate her humorous dialogue without worry, and then later think back to how they probably should have seen her love for murdering humans coming. While the way a villain is portrayed to the player is important, if they're supposed to be likable, they need some likable qualities qualities about them. There are many reasons we end up gravitating towards others, but a major one is that people tend to like those who have something to offer them. With companions in games, this comes in the form of assistance, whether it be through gameplay mechanics or events within the story, both leading to forming a clear bond between player and companion. Villains, on the other hand, have far less options when it comes to having something to offer the player, as they, more often than not, are actively trying to thwart them. Some games frame the villain as a sort of mentor to the protagonist, providing useful lessons and seeming to genuinely care about them, despite also maybe wanting to kill them. Others put the protagonist and villain in a situation where they need to overcome a common obstacle, allowing players to get a better understanding for them before going back to their old ways. From what I've seen, the most common approach to making a villain more endearing, especially in games, is through humor. While a villain may not have any help to offer, if they can get a player to laugh or smile at a joke, it shifts how the player views them. As it turns out, people like funny stuff, so it is natural that they gravitate towards characters who provide that. As dumb as it is, the funnier I find a villain, the longer I hope they stick around. GLaDOS spends an exorbitant amount of time trying to torment and kill the player character, but her dry humor and perfect comedic timing made me always want her around. I cared about her character, to the point where in Portal 2, when more information is given about her backstory, I was entirely invested in how she came to be. Handsome Jack's another example of a villain who uses comedy to disarm the player, creating a playful yet still dangerous rivalry. This setup leads to a surprising shift in Jack after he loses someone important to him, which completely changes how he interacts with the player from that moment on. A sense of somberness replaces the bombastic nature the player had grown used to, which made me feel a tinge of sadness for him and his life, even though, like, everything bad that happened to him was entirely his fault. The game used comedy to lower my walls, and it used tragedy to get me to understand him better. There's a subset of likable villains that I don't fully understand, as they kind of go against everything that should make a character likable. But a lot of people gravitate towards villains who have an unpredictable and cruel nature. Like the Joker. He has endured as one of the most beloved villains for so long, partially because he is genuinely funny, but mostly because he never ceases to shock audiences. Villains like this, who can best be described as charismatic psychopaths, are fascinating to watch because of the uncertainty that comes with every scene they are in. Their motivations typically come from a place of wanting to see the beauty of chaos. While they may amass power, their goal more often than not isn't to rule or destroy the world, but rather to see how far they can push the limits of humanity. For this reason, these kinds of characters are often the least redeemable, and in a real-world context, they would be beyond terrifying. But within fiction, their lack of inhibition and empathy makes them extremely intriguing, leaving audiences wanting to see more. Voss from Far Cry 3 and Sander Cohen from BioShock are both examples of characters who command the player's attention while they're on screen, and their warped sense of reality is so unbelievable and unrelatable that it is hard not to have a morbid sense of curiosity about them and what it was that brought them to where they are now. However, the thing that seems to draw people to villains the most is when they are relatable in some profound way. Villains are most likable when it is easy to imagine oneself in their position and understand why they do the things they do, even though audiences will not agree with their actions. Unless, I guess, the audience too is a villain. It can be argued that these tragic villains show a side of humanity that protagonists rarely do. They are the ones who make hard choices in an effort to fix the problems they see in themselves and the world around them. What sets them apart from others is the length they are willing to go to do so. However, this is where I think video games often fall short compared to other forms of media, and it comes back to how games typically don't spend enough time with the villain to fully develop them. Players don't often get to see villains interacting with characters aside from the protagonist, which makes it hard to understand who they are on a broader scale. It is also rare for games to show the process of how the villain grew into the person they've become. While learning about a villain's progression through radio conversations is better than nothing, it ends up being less effective than seeing the transformation firsthand. This isn't to say it's impossible to have a villain players feel empathy for. There are plenty of interesting tragic villains in video games. I just think that games haven't found the optimal way to present them yet, which is fair as it's a relatively new medium that's still exploring the different ways it can tell a story. All in all, a villain being likable is obviously subjective. The things I talk about in this video are some of the common trends I've noticed, but it isn't a science. Everyone views the actions of a character differently and will judge them differently because of that. When it comes to villains, it is tough to strike the right balance between being likable enough where the audience wants them to stick around longer and a little too likable where the audience starts excusing their terrible behavior. However, villains that aren't easily defined as pure evil are more realistic to our world and serve to teach us so much more than villains that are clearly all bad. With that said, while I am interested in this particular brand of villain, Likeable ones aren't well suited for every kind of story. There are a ton of incredible villains who I genuinely despise, and that is a huge reason why they are so effective. If you're a writer, whether it be for games or anything else, always consider what kind of story you want to tell. What are you going for in terms of tone? What major ideas do you want to explore? Figuring these things out will help you decide what kind of villain is best for your story, whether that be an unforgivable son of a bitch, a sympathetic monster, or a charismatic psychopath.
Did I ever tell you the definition of insanity?